The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. As Staff Sergeant Michael Torres adjusted his tactical vest one final time, the familiar weight of his gear felt comfortable against his shoulders. 22 pounds of protection that had become as natural as his own skin after 6 years of service. Beside him, Rex sat at perfect attention, his black and tan German Shepherd coat gleaming in the early light. The dog's intelligent amber eyes tracked every movement around them, ears perked forward in anticipation of the command that would send them into action. "You ready for this, boy?" Michael whispered, running his calloused hand through Rex's thick fur. The dog's tail gave a subtle wag, not the exuberant display of a pet, but the controlled response of a highly trained military working dog who understood that work time meant serious business. They had been partners for 3 years now, an inseparable team that had deployed twice to Afghanistan and completed over 200 explosive detection missions without a single casualty under their watch. Captain Jennifer Walsh approached with the day's briefing folder, her boots crunching against the gravel. "Torres, we've got a complex scenario today. Multiple IED placements in a simulated village environment. Intelligence suggests 3 devices, but there could be more." She handed him the tactical map, pointing to various marked locations. "This is the closest thing to real combat conditions we can create stateside. The brass wants to see if our new detection protocols hold up under pressure." Michael studied the map carefully, noting the narrow alleyways and potential choke points that would challenge both him and Rex. These training exercises had evolved significantly over the past year, incorporating lessons learned from the battlefield, with increasingly sophisticated dummy explosives that mimicked the scent signatures of actual threats. The military spared no expense in making these simulations as realistic as possible, knowing that the skills developed here would save lives. "Downrange." "Rex, heel," Michael commanded softly. The dog immediately moved to his left side, matching his handler's pace perfectly as they approached the mock village. The structure was an impressive replica of Afghan urban environments, complete with mud brick walls, narrow doorways, and the kind of debris-strewn streets that had become synonymous with modern warfare. Other soldiers playing the roles of civilians and insurgents had already taken their positions, adding another layer of realism to the exercise. As they entered the first building, Rex's demeanor shifted subtly. His nose twitched as he processed the thousands of scent molecules flooding his sensitive olfactory system. Military working dogs possessed scenting abilities 40 times more powerful than humans, capable of detecting explosive residue in concentrations so minute that the most sophisticated electronic equipment couldn't match their sensitivity. Rex had been trained to identify over a dozen different explosive compounds, from military-grade C4 to improvised devices constructed from agricultural fertilizers. The first 2 sweeps went flawlessly. Rex alerted to a simulated device hidden beneath a pile of construction materials, then located another concealed inside a water barrel. Each time, Michael followed proper protocol. Secure the area, call for explosive ordnance disposal, and document the find. The exercise was proceeding exactly as planned, with Rex demonstrating the exceptional skills that had earned him recognition as one of the top detection dogs in the entire army. It was in the third building that everything went catastrophically wrong. The device was supposed to be inert, a training egg that would emit the appropriate scent signature without any actual explosive components. Later investigations would reveal a critical failure in the supply chain. Somehow, a live IED intended for disposal had been mislabeled and included in the training materials. The mistake would result in court-martials, policy changes, and millions of dollars in lawsuits. But none of that would matter for Michael and Rex in the split second when the world exploded around them. Rex had just indicated the device's location. Beneath a wooden crate when the blast wave hit them like an invisible freight train. The explosion, equivalent to roughly 5 pounds of military-grade explosive, was powerful enough to collapse half the building's facade. Michael felt himself lifted off his feet, his body becoming a ragdoll tumbling through superheated air filled with concrete dust, metal fragments, and splinters of wood. Time seemed to slow as he flew 15 feet through the air, his mind processing the impossible reality that this wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not during a routine training exercise on American soil. The impact with the ground came like a sledgehammer to his entire body. Michael's tactical helmet cracked against a concrete block, the advanced polymer designed to stop bullets proving inadequate against the physics of his collision with the earth. His skull fractured in 3 places, brain tissue swelling against the confines of his cranium as cerebrospinal fluid began leaking from his ears. Somewhere in the chaos, he could hear Rex's agonized yelping, the sound cutting through his consciousness even as darkness began to close in around the edges of his vision. Blood pooled in the North Carolina dirt, mixing Michael's crimson life force with Rex's, as both warrior and dog lay motionless in the settling dust. The German shepherd had absorbed shrapnel in his left shoulder and rear leg, but his injuries, while serious, were far less critical than his handlers. As emergency medical technicians rushed toward the scene, Rex struggled to his feet, ignoring his own pain to crawl toward Michael's unconscious form. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of sterile hospital corridors, beeping monitors, and hushed conversations between doctors who spoke in medical terminology that Michael's family couldn't fully understand. Sarah Torres spent every waking moment beside her husband's bed, holding his hand and whispering stories about their life together, hoping that some part of him could hear her voice through the medically induced coma that was keeping his brain swelling under control. 5-year-old Emma didn't understand why Daddy wouldn't wake up, or why Mommy cried so much when she thought no one was looking. She drew pictures of their family stick figures of Mommy, Daddy, Emma, and Rex decorating the hospital room with colorful reminders of the life they had built together. The drawings showed a little girl's understanding of her world, a house with a triangle roof, a smiling sun, and 4 figures holding hands under a bright blue sky. When Michael finally opened his eyes on a Tuesday morning in late September, the first face he saw belonged to Emma. She had been reading him one of her favorite books, her small voice carefully sounding out each word the way her kindergarten teacher had shown her. But when her father's eyelids fluttered open and focused on her face, there was no recognition there, no spark of paternal love, no familiar warmth. He stared at her with the confused expression of someone looking at a complete stranger. "Daddy?" Emma whispered hopefully, reaching out to touch his hand. Michael recoiled slightly, his damaged brain unable to process the connection between this small child and any memories from his past. The explosion had stolen more than just his consciousness. It had erased entire chapters of his life, leaving behind gaps that might never be filled. The man who had once been able to field strip a rifle blindfolded now struggled to remember basic concepts like his own name. By the time the doctors delivered their full assessment, Rex had already been transferred to another base, assigned to a new handler who would never fully understand the unique bond that had existed between the injured dog and his original partner. The military machine moved forward with inevitable efficiency, processing Michael's medical discharge while simultaneously erasing his partnership with Rex from the active duty roster. In the sterile hospital room where Michael Torres lay surrounded by machines monitoring every biological function, a family tried to rebuild itself around a man who no longer remembered their shared history. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace, but for Sarah, Emma, and Michael, everything had fundamentally changed in the span of a single heartbeat, the moment when a training exercise became a tragedy that would define the rest of their lives. The front door of their modest ranch house in Fayetteville creaked as Sarah Torres helped her husband navigate the 3 steps up to their porch. 6 months had passed since the explosion, and Michael's physical wounds had healed remarkably well. Doctors called it miraculous, how completely his body had recovered. But the man she was supporting with her arm around his waist was a stranger wearing her husband's face, moving through their home like a tourist in a foreign country. "This is where you live," Sarah said gently, her voice carrying the exhausted patience of someone who had repeated this conversation dozens of times. "This is our home, Michael. You built that bookshelf yourself 2 summers ago. Remember? You spent 3 weekends cursing at the instructions, while Emma held the screws for you." Michael's hazel eyes, once warm and familiar, now distant and confused, swept across the living room, without a flicker of recognition. He paused at the mantelpiece, studying the collection of framed photographs as if they were exhibits in a museum. Wedding pictures, baby photos of Emma, snapshots of family vacations to Virginia Beach, images of him in full military dress uniform, receiving commendations, all of it meaningless to the damaged neural pathways in his brain. "That's us," Emma piped up from behind the couch, where she'd been hiding since they arrived home from the Veterans Affairs Hospital. At 5 years old, she possessed the resilient optimism that adults envied, but even she couldn't ignore the way her father flinched whenever she approached too quickly. "That's our wedding day, Daddy. Mommy wore the pretty white dress, and you cried when you saw her walking down the aisle." Michael touched the glass covering their wedding photo, his fingertip tracing Sarah's smiling face. "She's very beautiful," he said in the halting, measured way that had replaced his once confident speech patterns. Did I really marry her? It seems impossible that someone like her would choose someone like me." Sarah's heart shattered a little more each time he spoke about her in the third person, as if she were a character in a story rather than the woman who had shared his bed for 7 years. The Michael she had fallen in love with had been cocky, charming, absolutely certain of his place in the world. This Michael questioned everything, apologized constantly, and moved through each day like he was walking on thin ice. The neurologist at Walter Reed had explained the condition in clinical terms: severe traumatic brain injury with associated retrograde amnesia, executive function deficits, and damage to the hippocampus and frontal lobe. In layman's terms, the explosion had scrambled Michael's memories like eggs, leaving him with fragments that didn't connect to form a coherent picture of his life. Some patients recovered fully, others improved gradually over years, and some never regained what they'd lost. The doctors couldn't predict which category Michael would fall into. "Daddy, look what I drew for you." Emma bounded across the room with a fresh crayon masterpiece, her pigtails bouncing. The drawing showed their family of 3 standing in front of their house, with Rex prominently featured beside Michael. She had colored the German Shepherd with meticulous attention to detail, getting his markings exactly right from memory. But when Emma thrust the picture toward Michael, he instinctively stepped backward, his face clouding with the anxiety that seemed to follow him everywhere now. Loud noises made him jump. Sudden movements caused him to freeze, and physical contact from anyone, even his own daughter, triggered a fight-or-flight response he couldn't control. "I'm sorry," Michael mumbled, backing away from Emma's eager face. "I don't. Crowds make me nervous. Even small crowds. Even families, I guess." His voice cracked on the last word, and Sarah could see the self-loathing building behind his eyes. The Michael she knew would have scooped Emma up and spun her around the living room. This Michael was terrified of his own child. Emma's face crumpled as she watched her father retreat. "Why doesn't Daddy remember me, Mommy? Did I do something bad? Is that why he looks scared when I try to hug him?" "Oh, baby, no." Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, gathering her daughter into her arms while keeping one eye on Michael, who was now staring out the front window as if planning an escape route. Daddy's brain got hurt very badly. It's not your fault, sweetheart. It's not anyone's fault. The doctors say his memories might come back someday, but we have to be patient. Patient. The word had become Sarah's mantra, repeated like a prayer during the endless sleepless nights when Michael woke up screaming from nightmares he couldn't remember, during the frustrating therapy sessions where he struggled to relearn basic life skills, during the moments when she caught herself mourning the husband, who was still technically alive, but effectively gone forever. The financial strain was crushing what remained of their family stability. Michael's military disability payments covered the basic bills, but barely. Sarah had taken a job at Murphy's Diner on Main Street, working the breakfast and lunch shifts for tips that rarely exceeded $30 a day. 3 evenings a week, she cleaned offices at the medical complex downtown, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans, until midnight before driving home to check on Michael and Emma. Michael couldn't be left alone with Emma, not because he would intentionally hurt her, but because his damaged brain simply couldn't handle the responsibility. Simple tasks like making a sandwich or helping with homework became overwhelming challenges that sent him into panic attacks. Sarah's mother had moved in temporarily to help, but the arrangement was supposed to be short-term, and tensions were mounting in the overcrowded house. "I think I should sleep on the couch tonight," Michael announced suddenly, still staring out the window. "I don't want to disturb you with my nightmares again. You need your rest for work." Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying. They had been sleeping in separate bedrooms for 2 months now, ever since the night Michael had woken up swinging, believing he was back in Afghanistan under attack. She missed the warmth of his body beside her, missed the way he used to pull her close in his sleep, missed the intimacy that had been the foundation of their marriage. "Michael, this is your home," she said firmly. "You don't sleep on the couch in your own house." "But I don't remember it being my house," he replied, with heartbreaking honesty. "I feel like an intruder here, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, and eventually you'll figure out that I'm just a damaged stranger wearing your husband's face." Emma had retreated to her bedroom, clutching the drawing that her father couldn't bear to look at. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear her daughter talking to her stuffed animals, creating elaborate games where Daddy's memory came back and Rex returned home, and everything went back to the way it used to be. Children's games built on impossible wishes. That night, after Emma had cried herself to sleep, and Michael had taken his medication and retreated to the guest room, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table with a stack of medical bills and a calculator. That kept showing the same depressing total, no matter how many times she added the numbers. Outside, a train whistle echoed across the small North Carolina town, a lonely sound that perfectly captured how Sarah felt in her own home. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos of Michael in his army uniform, Rex at his side, both of them radiating the confidence and purpose that had attracted her in the first place. Somewhere out there, Rex was living with a new handler, probably wondering why his original partner had abandoned him. The thought made Sarah's chest tighten with grief for all the losses they'd sustained, not just Michael's memories, but the future they'd planned, the family traditions they'd never establish, the growing old together that might never happen. The house felt haunted by the ghosts of who they used to be, and Sarah wasn't sure any of them would survive the exorcism required to move forward. The emergency alert pierced the quiet morning air at Pinewood Elementary School like a digital scream, sending 847 children and 52 faculty members into immediate lockdown protocol. In classroom 2B, Mrs. Henderson quickly ushered her second graders away from the windows, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Everyone to the reading corner, just like we practiced," she whispered, turning off the lights and locking the door with trembling fingers. 3 miles away at Fort Liberty, the call came through the radio, crackling with urgent static. "All available K-9 units to Pinewood Elementary. Armed subject on campus. Multiple casualties reported. This is not a drill. Sergeant Marcus Johnson felt his stomach drop as he looked down at Rex, who was already sensing the tension radiating from his new handler. A German shepherd's ears were pinned forward, amber eyes alert and focused, but there was something different about him now, a barely controlled aggression that hadn't existed before the accident that took his original partner. Rex had been struggling with his new assignment for 8 months. Where he had once been calm and methodical with Michael Torres, he was now volatile and unpredictable with Johnson. The dog had already bitten 2 other handlers during training exercises. His legendary discipline eroded by what the veterinary behaviorists clinically termed separation anxiety disorder, but was experienced as a constant, gnawing emptiness where his bond with Michael used to be. "Come on, boy," Johnson said, clipping the tactical leash to Rex's harness. "We've got work to do." But as they loaded into the transport vehicle, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that he was handling a loaded weapon with a faulty safety. Rex was 85 pounds of muscle, teeth, and trauma, and Johnson had never fully earned the dog's trust or respect. The scene at Pinewood Elementary was chaos contained by yellow tape and flashing police lights. Parents pressed against the barriers, some screaming for their children, others standing in stunned silence as snippets of information filtered through the crowd. The gunman, later identified as 34-year-old Derek Masterson, had entered the school through an unlocked side entrance, armed with a stolen handgun and what witnesses described as a backpack full of something that clinked like metal. Inside the building, the hunt was methodical and terrifying. Rex's nose worked frantically as they cleared classroom after classroom, the dog's training overriding his emotional instability as he searched for the scent signatures of explosives and gunpowder residue. His new handler followed behind, weapon drawn, trying to read Rex's body language the way Michael Torres had done instinctively for 3 years. They found the first victim in the main hallway, Janet Walsh, a 28-year-old kindergarten teacher, who had stepped out of her classroom to check on unusual sounds. She was conscious, but bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to her shoulder, whimpering as paramedics worked to stabilize her for transport. Rex's reaction was immediate and visceral. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound that made even the seasoned paramedics step back. "He's tracking something," Johnson reported through his radio, though he wasn't entirely sure he was reading Rex's signals correctly. The dog was pulling hard toward the east wing, his movements sharp and aggressive in a way that differed from his usual methodical search pattern. Rex had detected something that set every instinct on fire, not just the clinical scent markers he'd been trained to identify, but the primal smell of fear, blood, and imminent danger that his wolf ancestors had recognized for millennia. The confrontation happened in the kindergarten wing, where Derek Masterson had barricaded himself in classroom K7 with 17 5-year-old children and their teacher, Mrs. Patricia Gomez. The gunman's psychological break had been brewing. For months, job loss, divorce, mounting debts, and a growing obsession with making someone pay attention to his pain had culminated in this moment of calculated violence. Rex and Johnson approached the classroom door just as Masterson fired 2 more shots, the sound echoing through the empty hallways like thunder. Through the door's small window, they could see children huddled in the corner, some crying silently, others frozen in terror. Mrs. Gomes was trying to shield as many as possible with her own body, her back to the gunman who was pacing erratically and muttering incoherently about making them understand. "This is Sergeant Johnson with K9 Rex." He radioed to the tactical team. "We have visual on the subject. 17 children in immediate danger. Requesting permission to." The door suddenly flew open. Masterson, wild-eyed and sweating, had decided to make his exit through the classroom's exterior door, using the children as human shields. But he hadn't counted on Rex's presence. and the sight of the German shepherd triggered a primal fear that made him swing his weapon toward the dog, instead of maintaining focus on his escape plan. What happened next would be dissected in police reports, news investigations, and trauma counseling sessions for years to come. Rex didn't wait for commands or tactical coordination. The moment he saw the gun barrel turning toward the huddled children, every molecule of his being focused on a single imperative: protect the innocent. The German shepherd launched himself at Masterson with the explosive power of a missile, covering the 15 feet between them in less than 2 seconds. The gunman's first shot caught Rex in the left shoulder, spinning him slightly, but not stopping his trajectory. The second bullet tore through the dog's rear haunch, and the third grazed his skull, leaving a bloody furrow through his black and tan fur. But Rex's momentum carried him into Masterson with devastating impact. 85 pounds of traumatized, protective fury slammed into the gunman's chest, driving him backward into the classroom wall with a sickening thud. Rex's jaws clamped down on the man's gun hand, crushing bones and forcing him to drop the weapon while 17 kindergartners watched their unlikely savior bleed all over the alphabet carpet. The takedown lasted less than 30 seconds, but the aftermath would define the rest of Rex's life. As tactical officers swarmed the classroom and paramedics rushed to treat his wounds, Rex lay panting on the floor, his amber eyes already showing. The 1,000-yard stare that marked another layer of trauma added to his psychological burden. He had saved 17 children, but the violence had broken something else inside him, pushing him further away from the disciplined military working dog he had once been. The media coverage was instantaneous and overwhelming. Hero dog saves. School children dominated news cycles, with Rex's bloodied image broadcast across every major network. Social media exploded with praise for the German shepherd's courage, but the cameras couldn't capture what the veterinary behaviorists saw during Rex's recovery. A war dog who had absorbed too much trauma, whose protective instincts had become a hair-trigger response to any perceived threat. 300 miles away in a small North Carolina town, Emma Torres was eating breakfast when the news report flickered across their kitchen television. The moment she saw Rex on the screen, wounded, heroic, but unmistakably her father's former partner, she dropped her spoon into her cereal bowl with a splash that sent milk across the table. "That's Daddy's dog," she screamed, pointing at the television with a trembling finger. "Mommy, that's Rex. He's hurt. Why is he bleeding? Where's Daddy?" Sarah rushed over to see what had upset her daughter, arriving just in time to see footage of Rex being carried from the school on a stretcher, his black and tan coat matted with blood, but his eyes still alert and defiant. The news anchor's voice provided the tragic context. The heroic German shepherd, identified as Rex, a former military working dog, sustained multiple gunshot wounds, but is expected to recover. However, sources close to the situation indicate that his injuries and the traumatic nature of this incident may result in his retirement from active duty. Emma pressed her small hands against the television screen, tears streaming down her face. "We have to help him, Mommy. If Rex comes home, maybe Daddy will remember us. Maybe Daddy will remember who he used to be." In the guest bedroom, Michael Torres heard his daughter crying, but couldn't bring himself to investigate. The sound of distress made his chest tighten with anxiety, and he pulled a pillow over his head, wondering why Emma's tears felt like they were tearing something loose. Inside his damaged brain, something that might have been a memory, or might have been just another phantom pain from a life he couldn't access. Sarah Torres stood in the cramped waiting room of Whitman and Associates Legal Services, clutching a manila folder stuffed with newspaper clippings, medical records, and Emma's countless drawings of Rex. The budget law office smelled like stale coffee and desperation, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across worn furniture that had seen too many broken dreams. But attorney Janet Morrison had taken their call, and that was more than Sarah had dared hope for. "They want to put him down," Sarah whispered across the desk, her voice breaking as she spread the newspaper headlines like tarot cards of doom. "Hero dog faces euthanization." "Military working dog, too dangerous for adoption." "School shooter." "Trauma leaves canine unstable." Each headline felt like a nail in Rex's coffin, and Sarah couldn't shake the image of Emma's tear-streaked face when she'd learned that her father's dog might be killed. Janet Morrison was 53 years old, gray-haired, and had built her career defending the forgotten veterans denied benefits, families destroyed by bureaucratic indifference, underdogs facing impossible odds. She'd seen enough cases to recognize the hollow look in Sarah's eyes, the particular exhaustion that came from fighting a system designed to grind people down until they gave up. "Tell me about Rex," Janet said, leaning forward with the intense focus that had made her legendary among North Carolina's veteran community. "Not the military working dog, not the hero from the news. Tell me about the dog your husband knew." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder, revealing photographs of Michael and Rex during their deployment. In the pictures, both man and dog radiated confidence and purpose. Rex sat at perfect attention beside Michael's camouflage uniform, his intelligent amber eyes reflecting absolute trust in his partner. These weren't just handler and dog. They were a bonded team forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. "Rex saved Michael's life 7 times in Afghanistan," Sarah began, her voice growing stronger as she shared their story. "Once, Rex detected an IED buried so deep that the electronic equipment missed it completely. Another time, he alerted to a suicide bomber in a crowded marketplace 30 seconds before the attack. Michael used to say that Rex could read his mind, that they were connected on some level that went beyond training." Janet studied the photographs carefully, noting the body language between man and dog that spoke of profound partnership. She'd handled enough military cases to understand the unique bonds formed between canine teams, relationships that often became the most stable element in a soldier's life amid the chaos of combat deployment. "What happened after the accident?" Janet asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They separated them immediately," Sarah said bitterly. "Michael was in a coma, so nobody asked what he would have wanted. Rex was reassigned to Sergeant Johnson, and from what I've been able to find out, it's been a disaster. Rex has attacked 4 different handlers, refuses to follow commands consistently, and shows signs of severe behavioral problems." The veterinary reports describe him as aggressive, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to military personnel. Janet made notes on her legal pad, her mind already formulating the complex arguments that would be necessary to challenge military bureaucracy. "And now, after the school shooting? Now they're using his heroism against him," Sarah said with disgust. The official report states that Rex's actions while preventing loss of life, DEMONSTRATE, uncontrolled aggressive responses, and inability to follow tactical protocols. They're arguing that his decision to attack without waiting for commands proves he's too unstable for military service or civilian adoption. The legal landscape was treacherous. Military working dogs were considered government property, subject to military regulations that civilian courts rarely challenged. Most retired canines south were either adopted by their handlers or euthanized if deemed unsuitable for civilian life. Rex's case was complicated by his behavioral issues, his high-profile media attention, and the military's legitimate concerns about liability. "There is precedent," Janet said slowly, pulling a thick legal tome from her bookshelf. United States v. Johnson 2019. A federal judge ruled that military working dogs suffering from PTSD should be evaluated for therapeutic placement with their original handlers if separation trauma is determined to be the primary cause of behavioral issues. Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. "You think we can save him?" "I think we can try," Janet replied, but her expression remained cautious. "However, I have to be honest about the challenges we're facing. The military will argue that Michael's condition makes him unsuitable to care for a large, potentially aggressive animal. They'll point to Rex's attack record, his failure to bond with new handlers, and the liability concerns if he injures someone in civilian life." That afternoon, Janet filed the initial legal papers requesting a hearing to determine Rex's fate. The case immediately attracted media attention, with veterans' rights organizations and animal welfare groups rallying behind the Torres family. Social media campaigns using hashtags like #SaveRex and #BringRexHome generated thousands of posts. From supporters who saw the case as emblematic of how the military treated both its human and canine veterans. But the military's response was swift and bureaucratically brutal. Colonel Patricia Hayes, speaking for the Judge Advocate General's office, released a statement that was clinical in its dismissal. "While we appreciate Rex's heroic service, our primary responsibility is public safety. Rex has demonstrated patterns of aggressive behavior that make him unsuitable for civilian placement. Euthanization is the most humane option for an animal suffering from severe psychological trauma." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Euthanization, humane option. Psychological trauma. The same terms that medical professionals had used when discussing Michael's prognosis, as if both man and dog were broken beyond repair. Emma's reaction to the news was heartbreaking. She refused to eat dinner, instead sitting on her bedroom floor with her crayons, drawing picture after picture of Rex in a cage, Rex with bandages, Rex looking sad and alone. In her 5-year-old mind, saving Rex had become synonymous with saving her family, as if bringing the dog home could somehow restore the father who no longer recognized her. "Mommy, can we visit Rex?" Emma asked during one of her sleepless nights, crawling into Sarah's bed for comfort. "Maybe if Daddy sees him, he'll remember who we are. Maybe Rex remembers Daddy, even if Daddy doesn't remember Rex." The innocent logic was devastating in its clarity. Emma had identified something that the adults had missed in their focus on legal strategies and medical terminology, the possibility that love and loyalty might transcend memory loss, that the bond between Michael and Rex might exist on a level deeper than conscious recollection. Janet worked 18-hour days preparing their case, reaching out to experts in animal behavior, traumatic brain injury, and military law. She interviewed former handlers who testified to the unique nature of canine partnerships, gathered scientific studies on the therapeutic benefits of service animals for brain injury patients, and documented every instance of Rex's behavioral problems that could be traced to his separation from Michael. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Amanda Chun, a neuropsychologist at Duke University, who specialized in treating veterans with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Dr. Chun had been following the case through media coverage and reached out to offer her expertise. The bond between military working dogs and their handlers is neurochemically similar to human pair bonding. Dr. Chun explained during their first meeting. Rex's behavioral problems aren't just psychological, they're physiological responses to the disruption of a profound neurochemical connection. Separating bonded canine teams can be compared to forcibly separating married couples or parents from their children. Armed with Dr. Chun's research and a growing coalition of supporters, Janet prepared for the legal battle that would determine whether Rex lived or died. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away, and every day that passed brought them closer to a confrontation that would test the limits of military bureaucracy, legal precedent, and the power of love to overcome institutional indifference. In her small apartment, Sarah counted down the days while watching her husband struggle with basic tasks and her daughter retreat further into fantasies where everyone she loved came home safely. The legal fight for Rex had become about more than saving one traumatized dog. It had become about whether broken families could heal, whether love could transcend memory, and whether the system that had created their wounds could be forced to help mend them. The October morning was crisp and cloudless as Sarah Torres drove her battered Honda Civic through the gates of Fort Liberty, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Michael stared out the passenger window with the vacant expression that had become his default since the accident, occasionally asking questions that broke Sarah's heart. Why are we here? Do I know this place? Are you sure I'm supposed to be here? Sarah had spent 2 weeks convincing Janet Morrison that this unsanctioned visit was necessary. The hearing was only days away, and their case hinged on proving that Rex's behavioral problems stemmed from his separation from Michael. They needed to document the interaction between man and dog, even if that interaction proved their theory wrong. I need to see what we're really fighting for, Sarah had argued during their heated discussion in Janet's office. If Rex doesn't remember Michael, if there's no connection left between them, then maybe the military is right. Maybe euthanization is the kindest option. Janet had eventually agreed, though she'd made it clear that this visit was legally risky. If Rex attacked Michael or showed no recognition, the military could use the evidence to strengthen their case for putting the dog down. But Sarah was desperate for answers, and sometimes desperation was the only fuel strong enough to power hope through impossible circumstances. Master Sergeant David Kim met them at the veterinary facility, his expression carefully neutral as he escorted them through the maze of administrative buildings toward the isolation kennel, where Rex had been housed since the school shooting. Kim had worked with military working dogs for 15 years, and he'd seen enough broken partnerships to recognize the tragedy unfolding with Rex. I have to warn you, Kim said as they approached the kennel area. Rex isn't the same dog your husband knew. The behavioral reports don't begin to capture how much he's changed. He's attacked 4 handlers in the past month, including one who required 12 stitches. We've had to keep him in isolation because he won't tolerate the presence of other dogs or unfamiliar humans. The sound hit them before they saw him, a low, continuous growling that seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls of the facility. It was the sound of an animal that had moved beyond aggression into something approaching madness, a noise. That made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up and caused Michael to stop walking entirely. That's a dog? Michael asked, his damaged brain struggling to process the threatening sounds echoing from the kennel ahead. It sounds like a wild animal. Rex's kennel was larger than Sarah had expected, but it felt like a prison cell designed for a creature that had been condemned to death. The German shepherd paced in tight circles, his black and tan coat matted and unkempt, his once bright amber eyes now dulled by psychological trauma and pharmaceutical sedatives. Healing wounds from the school shooting were visible across his shoulder and haunch, pink scars that stood out against his dark fur like battle ribbons he'd never wanted to earn. The moment Rex saw movement outside his kennel, he launched himself at the chain-link fence with explosive fury. 85 pounds of traumatized muscle and bone crashed against the metal barrier, his jaws snapping at empty air as foam flew from his muzzle. The impact was so violent that Sarah instinctively stepped backward, pulling Michael with her. Jesus Christ, Michael breathed, and Sarah realized it was the first time she'd heard him use profanity since the accident. The old Michael had cursed like a soldier, but this Michael was usually so careful with his language that hearing him swear felt like a glimpse of his former personality breaking through. Rex continued his assault on the fence, barking with a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. This wasn't the controlled aggression of a trained military working dog. This was the raw fury of an animal that had been pushed beyond its psychological breaking point. His eyes were wild, unfocused, scanning the humans outside his cage without any sign of recognition or rational thought. "Rex," Michael said quietly, the name falling from his lips without conscious thought. The effect was immediate and devastating. Rex stopped mid-bark, his body freezing as if he'd been struck by lightning. For a moment, the German shepherd stood perfectly still, his head cocked to one side, his ears forward in the listening position that Sarah remembered from better times. Then, slowly, Rex approached the fence where Michael stood. But instead of the joyful reunion Sarah had desperately hoped for, Rex's response was even more heartbreaking. The dog began to whine, not the excited vocalizations of a happy animal, but the keening sound of grief given voice. Rex pressed his nose against the chain-link fence, his amber eyes fixed on Michael's face with an intensity that seemed to burn. "He knows you," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Michael, he remembers you." But Michael showed no reciprocal recognition. He stared at Rex with the same polite confusion he displayed when looking at family photographs, his damaged brain unable to access the memories that had once made this dog the most important partner in his life. When Michael extended his hand toward the fence, it was with the cautious gesture of someone approaching an unfamiliar animal, not the confident touch of a handler reuniting with his canine partner. Rex's reaction to Michael's tentative approach was immediate and violent. The dog lunged at the fence again, but this time his aggression seemed directed inward, as if he was trying to tear through the barrier that separated him from the only human who had ever truly understood him. He clawed at the metal mesh until his paws bled, his whines escalating into howls that echoed through the entire facility. "I don't understand," Michael said, stepping back from the fence as Rex's distress intensified. "Why is he so upset? Did I do something wrong?" A question broke something inside Sarah's chest. Here was her husband, watching his former partner's psychological breakdown, unable to comprehend that he was the cause of Rex's anguish simply by existing without memory. Michael's innocent confusion made the tragedy even more profound. He was grieving the loss of a relationship he couldn't remember having. Master Sergeant Kim made notes on his clipboard, his expression grim as he observed the interaction. "This is what we've been dealing with," he said quietly. Rex shows signs of recognizing certain stimuli voices sense specific commands, but his response is always distress rather than comfort. It's like he's mourning someone who's standing right in front of him. Sarah watched as Rex continued his frantic attempts to reach Michael, the dog's powerful body throwing itself against the fence with desperate determination. Each impact seemed to drive the metal deeper into Rex's psyche, creating fresh wounds on top of scars that had never properly healed. "We should go," Sarah said finally, unable to watch any more of Rex's suffering. But as they turned to leave, something happened that made her blood run cold. Michael collapsed. Not a physical collapse, but something deeper, a psychological crumbling that sent him to his knees in the dirt outside Rex's kennel. His hands pressed against his temples, as if trying to hold his fractured thoughts together. And for the first time since the accident, Sarah heard him make a sound that resembled the man she'd married. A broken sob that seemed to come from the same place as Rex's keening. "It hurts," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible above Rex's continued howling. "I don't know why, but looking at him hurts. Like there's something important I'm supposed to remember, but every time I try to reach for it, it disappears." Sarah knelt beside her husband in the dirt, holding him as he trembled with the effort of trying to access memories that might no longer exist. Behind the fence, Rex had gone silent, his amber eyes fixed on the broken man who had once been his entire world. The dog's expression had changed from wild aggression to something that looked almost like understanding, as if Rex recognized that his partner was suffering from wounds that went deeper than physical scars. The visit that was supposed to provide answers had only generated more questions. Rex clearly remembered Michael, but his memory was a source of torment rather than comfort. Michael's brain seemed to recognize something significant about Rex, but the recognition came with pain rather than clarity. And Sarah was left to wonder whether fighting for Rex's life meant condemning both man and dog to a different kind of suffering, the eternal ache of loving someone who could never love you back in the same way again. As they drove away from Fort Liberty, Rex's howls echoing behind them until distance finally muted the sound, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of their legal battle. Win or lose, she would fight for Rex's freedom, because sometimes love meant choosing hope over evidence, faith over logic, and the possibility of healing over the certainty of loss. The courtroom was packed to its rafters, every bench taken, the air charged with the weight of public scrutiny. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, their chants leaking faintly through the heavy walls. One side shouted for accountability. The other cried for justice delayed. Inside, the gallery was a swirl of anticipation reporters, poised with notepads, families whispering, eyes fixed on the defendant. The trial had become more than a case. It was a spectacle, a symbol, a battlefield, fought in words instead of weapons. Colonel Hayes rose first. His uniform seemed pressed into the very fabric of discipline, his posture straight as a rifle. His voice carried the sharp edge of command, cold and clinical, each sentence clipped like an order marked across a parade ground. He spoke of incident, reports, crime scene details, and sworn testimonies as though briefing a unit before deployment. With military precision, he clicked through a slideshow projected on the courtroom screen timelines, victim photographs, procedural charts. To the jury, it was a barrage of facts, each one landing with the weight of inevitability. But the defense had been waiting. Dr. May Chun, a neuroscientist whose work had recently shaken the academic world, stepped forward. Petite and soft-spoken, she carried a quiet confidence that contrasted Hayes' severity. Her credentials were laid out formally: doctoral fellowships, published studies, peer-reviewed breakthroughs. She clicked her first slide, revealing the glow of brain scans, neural patterns illuminated in blue and red. Her testimony was revolutionary. Dogs, she explained, were not merely companions or tools. Scientific imaging showed grief patterns in human brains when bonds with canine partners were severed. These patterns mirrored those of familial loss. The brain, Dr. Chun said evenly, does not distinguish between the grief for a father, a child, or a service animal. The neural response is identical. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward, her pen paused above her notepad. The weight of the data pressed against the prosecution's mechanical narrative, turning sterile facts into something visceral and human. Then came Master Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez. His presence was not academic, but lived, weathered by years of deployments. His voice carried the weight of dust-filled nights and missions, where the margin between life and death was a heartbeat. He spoke of canine units in combat dogs, alerting troops to hidden explosives, saving lives with instincts sharper than technology could replicate. His testimony was raw, personal. "You don't just work with them," Rodriguez said, his gaze firm. "You trust them with your life, and they trust you back." The room was silent. His words were not numbers or charts. They were truth forged in fire. The prosecution bristled, ready to challenge. Colonel Hayes shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. But it was Janet Morrison who rose next, her presence commanding in a way entirely her own. She was not loud, not dramatic. Instead, she dissected Hayes' prior testimony with the precision of a surgeon. She questioned gaps in procedure, protocols applied without flexibility, the absence of acknowledgement for human factors in military records. Every question tightened a knot the prosecution struggled to untie. Her strategy was simple but devastating. Expose that the cold facts were incomplete because they stripped away humanity. Then it happened. Emma's voice, small but piercing. She had been quiet all morning, clinging to her grandmother's side. But as Dr. Chan's slides lingered on the screen, the child's words slipped into the stillness. "Is that Daddy?" The courtroom froze. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular. She wasn't testifying. She was remembering. Her innocent tone cut sharper than any cross-examination. In her young eyes, the dog projected on the screen wasn't evidence, it was connection. The human cost of bureaucracy, distilled into a child's fragile recognition. The judge, who had remained stern and distant for weeks, now leaned forward. "Dr. Chun," she said, her voice measured, "could you expand on the implications of these findings, particularly in relation to a child's recognition of a bond?" The defense attorney's eyes flicked with subtle triumph. The jury leaned closer, hanging on every word. The gallery seemed to forget to breathe. Outside, the chants of protesters pressed faintly like waves against the courthouse walls. But here, inside, it was the child's voice that shifted everything. Dr. Chun explained that children's memories of bonds with animals could last years, even lifetimes, embedded in emotional centers of the brain. Her question, Chun concluded softly, is not random. It is a memory surfacing, one that aligns with the neuroscience we now understand. Colonel Hayes moved to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Objection noted," she said curtly. "We will hear the continuation." The tension in the room thickened. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors exchanged glances that betrayed uncertainty, even curiosity. The defendant, for the first time in weeks, lifted his gaze, hope flickering across his tired features. The judge tapped her pen against the desk, a steady rhythm that matched the growing suspense. "This court," she announced, "requires further examination of the K-9 in question. I will not proceed without first-hand evaluation." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. The child's eyes widened. The defense stiffened with anticipation. Even Hayes' expression faltered, his once ironclad certainty cracking. The judge closed her folder with a decisive thud. "This session is adjourned until tomorrow. At that time, the court will admit Rex for direct evaluation." The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. The gallery erupted in whispers, reporters rushing to the exits to file stories. Protesters outside swelled in noise as the news leaked within minutes. Emma clutched her grandmother's arm, whispering, "Daddy will see him again?" The grandmother, her face trembling with hope, she dared not voice, pressed the child close. The defendant sat motionless, his heart thudding. Tomorrow, Rex would be here. Tomorrow, everything could change. The case no longer felt like law alone. It had become something deeper, truth balanced on the bond between a man, his child, and a dog who might hold the key to freedom. The courtroom, once a machine of procedure, now waited like a living thing. And everyone knew the next day would decide everything. The second day of the hearing began with an electricity in the air that made everyone's skin feel charged. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the packed courtroom with a grim expression that revealed nothing about the decision she'd reached during her sleepless night of deliberation. The legal precedents were contradictory, the scientific evidence compelling but untested in courtroom application, and the human stakes immeasurable. Sarah Torres had barely slept, her mind cycling through every possible outcome. Beside her, Emma clutched a new drawing, this one showing Rex and Michael sitting together under a rainbow, both of them smiling in the way that only a child's imagination could envision. Michael had stayed home again, the stress of the proceedings triggering anxiety attacks that left him unable to function in public settings. "Before I render my decision," Judge Hawkins announced, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I want to address the unprecedented nature of this case. The court has heard compelling testimony from both sides regarding Rex's behavioral issues, the Torres family's circumstances, and the broader implications for military working dog policy. Janet Morrison felt her stomach clench. In her experience, judges who prefaced their rulings with lengthy explanations were usually preparing to deliver bad news. She glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone pale as she prepared for the worst. However, Judge Hawkins continued, and the single word sent a ripple of hope through the defense side of the courtroom. The court is troubled by the lack of direct evidence regarding the current relationship between Rex and Staff Sergeant Torres. The testimony has been largely theoretical, based on observations, reports, and scientific studies, but we have not seen the actual interaction between these two individuals. Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This was not the direction she had expected the ruling to take. Therefore, Judge Hawkins announced, the court is making an unusual but necessary request. I am ordering that Rex be brought into this courtroom so that we may observe firsthand the interaction between the dog and Staff Sergeant Torres. The courtroom erupted. Colonel Hayes shot to her feet, objecting vehemently. Your Honor, this is highly irregular and potentially dangerous. Rex has attacked multiple handlers and poses a significant safety risk to everyone in this courtroom, including the plaintiff's family. But Judge Hawkins was unmoved. The court acknowledges the risks, Colonel Hayes, but the stakes of this decision require direct observation rather than second-hand testimony. Proper safety precautions will be taken. Janet Morrison could barely contain her excitement. This was exactly the breakthrough they needed, a chance to demonstrate that Rex's connection to Michael transcended his behavioral problems with other handlers. But as she looked at Sarah's terrified expression, she realized that this moment could either save Rex's life or provide the final evidence needed to justify his execution. 30 minutes later, the courtroom had been reconfigured into something resembling a controlled behavioral laboratory. Bailiffs had cleared the center aisle, creating a wide corridor between the plaintiff and defense tables. EMTs stood ready in the hallway, and Dr. Amanda Chun had been positioned as an expert observer to interpret Rex's behavior in real time. The sound came first, the metallic scraping of claws against concrete as Rex fought against his transport crate in the hallway outside the courtroom. Then came the growling, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the building's foundation and into the bones of everyone present. Several spectators in the gallery shifted nervously, and Emma moved closer to her mother, her small hand finding Sarah's trembling fingers. When the doors opened, 5 handlers in full protective gear struggled to control the wheeled crate containing 85 pounds of traumatized, furious German Shepherd. Rex's barking echoed off the courtroom walls like gunshots, each vocalization filled with rage, confusion, and desperation. Through the reinforced mesh of the transport crate, his amber eyes blazed with the wild intensity of an animal that had been pushed beyond its psychological breaking point. The handlers positioned the crate in the center of the courtroom, and Judge Hawkins made her second unprecedented decision of the morning. Open the crate, but keep Rex muzzled and on a reinforced lead. I want to observe his behavior when he can see and smell Staff Sergeant Torres clearly. Your Honor, Colonel Hayes protested again. This is extremely dangerous. Rex has shown no ability to control his aggressive responses in any environment outside his isolation kennel. But Janet Morrison was already moving. Your Honor, if I may call Staff Sergeant Torres to the courtroom? The doors opened again, and Michael Torres entered slowly, supported by Sarah's mother, and moving with the careful gait of someone whose brain still struggled to coordinate complex motor functions. He wore his dress uniform Sarah had insisted on it, knowing that military protocols and symbols might trigger deeper memories than civilian clothes could access. The moment Michael appeared in the doorway, Rex's behavior changed dramatically. The deafening barking stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch, replaced by a silence so complete that the courtroom's ventilation system suddenly seemed loud. Rex stood perfectly still in his transport crate, his head cocked to one side in the listening position that Dr. Chun had described in her testimony. "Release him," Judge Hawkins ordered, and the handlers reluctantly opened the crate door. Rex emerged slowly, his powerful body coiled with tension, but his movements suddenly controlled and purposeful. The muzzle covered his jaws, and the reinforced lead was held by handler Martinez. But Rex's attention was focused entirely on the man in the military uniform standing 30 feet away. Emma pressed against her mother, pointing with a trembling finger at the magnificent German shepherd who had dominated her drawings and dreams for months. "Is that Daddy?" she whispered, her innocent question cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife through silk. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then something extraordinary happened. Michael's head snapped up at the sound of his daughter's voice, his damaged brain processing the familiar syllables that had somehow penetrated the fog of his memory loss. For the first time since the accident, he spoke his daughter's name clearly and with recognition. Emma. The single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the entire courtroom. But it was Rex's reaction that took everyone's breath away. The German shepherd went completely still, his amber eyes locked on Michael's face with laser intensity. Then, impossibly, Rex's tail began to wag, not the frantic motion of excitement, but the slow, controlled movement of a dog who had recognized something profound and important. Rex took a step forward, then another, his movements careful and deliberate despite the handler's attempts to maintain control of the lead. There was no aggression in his posture now, no wild fury or unpredictable violence. Instead, Rex moved with the focused purpose of a military working dog who had just located his missing partner. When Rex reached the invisible boundary that his training had taught him to respect close enough to protect, far enough to avoid crowding, he sat at perfect attention, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. It was the exact position he had maintained during hundreds of missions in Afghanistan, the posture that said, "I am here. I am ready. I am yours." Michael stared down at the dog, his brow furrowed with the concentration of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "I know you," he said slowly, the words emerging from some deep place that even the explosion hadn't been able to destroy. "I don't remember how, but I know you're important. I know you're mine." Rex's tail wagged faster, and from behind the muzzle came a sound that Dr. Chun would later describe as the canine equivalent of sobbing, a keening whine that spoke of months of grief, confusion, and desperate hope finally finding its target. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as man and dog stared at each other across a gulf of damaged memory and institutional separation, connected by something stronger than consciousness, deeper than recollection, more enduring than the trauma that had tried to destroy them both. Judge Hawkins leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bailiff, remove Rex's muzzle." "Your Honor." Colonel Hayes started to object, but the judge silenced her with a look. The muzzle came off, and Rex did something that no one in the courtroom had expected. He lay down at Michael's feet and placed his head across his former handler's boots, assuming the position that military working dogs use to claim and protect their partners. Michael reached down slowly, his hand hovering over Rex's head for a moment before making contact with the familiar black and tan fur. The touch seemed to complete a circuit that had been broken for 14 months, and Rex's tail thumped against the courtroom floor with the steady rhythm of a heart that had finally found its way home. 6 months after Judge Patricia Hawkins rendered her historic decision, the front porch of the Torres family home in Fayetteville had become a place of quiet miracles. Michael sat in his wheelchair, not because he couldn't walk, but because the gentle motion helped calm his anxiety, with Rex stretched out beside him on the weathered wooden planks. The German shepherd's massive head rested across Michael's feet in the protective position that had become their constant configuration, amber eyes alert and watchful, even in peaceful moments. The transformation hadn't been immediate or complete. Michael's memories remained fragmented, scattered like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, with half the pieces permanently lost. But Rex's presence had somehow reorganized the remaining fragments into something that resembled a coherent picture of who Michael Torres used to be, and more importantly, who he was becoming. "Tell me about school, little bird," Michael said, using the pet name that had mysteriously returned during their second week together. Emma giggled as she bounced up the porch steps, her backpack bouncing against her small frame, her face bright with the kind of joy that only children who have had their world restored can radiate. "Mrs. Patterson said I could bring Rex for show and tell." "Next Friday," Emma announced, dropping her backpack and immediately sprawling on the porch beside the German shepherd. Rex's tail thumped against the wooden boards, and he lifted his head to accept Emma's enthusiastic hug, a gesture that would have been impossible during his traumatized months of isolation. Sarah emerged from the house, carrying a pitcher of sweet tea, pausing in the doorway to watch the scene that still felt like a dream after months of nightmare. Michael's speech remained halting, his memory gaps significant, but Rex's therapeutic influence had unlocked something precious. His capacity for love, his ability to be present with his family, his gradual recognition that this house, these people, this life belonged to Tim. The legal victory had been just the beginning of a long healing process. Judge Hawkins' ruling had established groundbreaking precedent for military working dog placement, but it had also come with strict conditions. Rex required ongoing behavioral therapy, monthly evaluations by veterinary psychiatrists, and a comprehensive support system that included Dr. Amanda Chun's continued research into the neurochemical bonds between canine teams. The first month had been the hardest. Rex's aggressive episodes didn't disappear overnight, and there were moments when Sarah questioned whether they were putting everyone at risk for the sake of hope. But Dr. Chun's protocols had worked slowly and steadily. Rex's therapy involved gradual exposure to triggering situations, positive reinforcement training, and pharmaceutical support that helped regulate his stress hormones. More importantly, Rex's healing seemed to accelerate Michael's own recovery. The neuroplasticity of the human brain, Dr. Chun explained, could be stimulated by familiar stimuli that triggered dormant neural pathways. Rex's presence didn't restore Michael's lost memories, but it helped his brain create new connections that allowed him to function more effectively in the present. "Daddy, watch this," Emma called out, producing a tennis ball from her backpack. Rex immediately shifted into alert mode, his training overriding his relaxed state as he focused on the potential projectile. But instead of the aggressive vigilance that had characterized his isolation period, Rex now displayed controlled interest, the behavior of a working dog who understood the difference between play and threat. Emma threw the ball across the small front yard, and Rex bounded after it with the enthusiasm of a dog rediscovering joy. His movements were still powerful and precise, but the desperate edge that had marked his post-trauma behavior had softened into something approaching normal. Canine playfulness. "Good boy, Rex," Michael said, and the words came naturally, automatically, as if they'd been stored in some part of his brain that trauma couldn't touch. When Rex returned with the ball, he dropped it at Michael's feet and assumed his protective position, completing the cycle of play and duty that defined his new life. Sarah settled into the porch swing, watching her reconstructed family with wonder and gratitude. The financial stress hadn't disappeared. Michael's disability benefits covered the basics, but his ongoing medical care and Rex's specialized therapy were expensive. However, the media attention from their legal victory had brought unexpected support. Veterans organizations had established a fund to help cover Rex's care, and Sarah had been offered a better job at the regional medical center, working with families dealing with traumatic brain injury. The changes in their daily routine were subtle but profound. Michael no longer spent entire days staring out windows or struggling with basic tasks. Rex's presence gave him purpose-feeding schedules to maintain, exercise routines to follow, a companion who needed care and attention. The responsibility seemed to activate parts of Michael's brain that had been dormant since the explosion. "I have something to show you," Sarah said, pulling a letter from her pocket. The letterhead bore the seal of the United States Congress, and Michael's name was typed across the front in official government font. "What is it?" Michael asked, accepting the letter with the careful movements that still characterized his handling of important documents. "Congressman Martinez wants you to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee," Sarah explained, her voice filled with pride. "They're drafting new legislation about military working dog placement and veteran rehabilitation programs. They want to hear your story." Michael studied the letter, his brow furrowed with concentration as he processed the implications. "They want me to talk to Congress? About Rex?" "About both of you," Sarah said. "About what you've accomplished together." The idea of speaking publicly still terrified Michael, but he looked down at Rex, whose steady presence had become his anchor in a world that often felt unstable and confusing. "What do you think, boy? Should we tell them about second chances?" Rex's tail thumped against the porch, and Michael interpreted the response as enthusiastic agreement. 3 months later, Michael Torres sat before a panel of congressional representatives. Rex lying calmly beside his chair in the formal hearing room of the Rayburn House office building. Michael's testimony was halting but powerful, his words carrying the weight of lived experience rather than political rhetoric. "Rex didn't just save my life in Afghanistan," Michael said, his voice steady despite the crowd of reporters and officials watching his every word. "He saved my life after. I came home broken. The military taught us both how to be warriors, but Rex taught me how to be human again. Sometimes healing isn't about getting back what you lost. Sometimes it's about discovering what you still have." In the gallery, Sarah held Emma on her lap, both of them watching as Michael shared their story with the world. Emma waved at Rex, who remained perfectly still in his working position, but managed a subtle tail wag that only his family could detect. The legislation that emerged from those hearings would revolutionize military working dog policy, establishing programs for therapeutic placement and mandating evaluation protocols that prioritized healing over bureaucratic convenience. But for the Torres family, the real victory was quieter and more personal. On a warm spring evening, as the sun set over their small North Carolina town, Michael Torres sat on his front porch with his daughter reading him stories and his wife planning their future. Beside them, Rex maintained his eternal vigil, no longer the traumatized animal facing euthanization, but a dog who had rediscovered his purpose, protecting the family that had refused to give up on him, just as he had never given up on them. Sometimes love transcended memory. Sometimes healing happened in fragments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. And sometimes the most profound victories were measured not in what was recovered, but in what was built from the pieces that remained. In the quiet sanctuary of their rebuilt life, Michael Torres understood that coming home wasn't about returning to who you used to be. It was about accepting who you had become and finding the courage to love that person just as fiercely as those who had never stopped believing in your capacity for healing.